The History of the Negro Church by Dr. Carter G Woodson. Chapter 1: The Early Missionaries and the Negro. One of the causes of the discovery of America was the translation into action of the desire of European zealots to extend the Catholic religion into other parts. Columbus, we are told, was decidedly missionary in his efforts, and felt that he could not make a more significant contribution to the church than to open new fields for Christian endeavor. His final success in securing the equipment adequate to the adventure upon the high seas was to some extent determined by the Christian motives, impelling the sovereigns of Spain to finance the expedition, for the reason that it might afford an opportunity for promoting the cause of Christ. Some of the French who came to the New World to establish their claims by further discovery and exploration, moreover, were either actuated by similar motives or welcomed the cooperation of earnest workers thus interested. The first persons proselyted by the Spanish and French missionaries were Indians. There was not any particular thought of the Negro. It may seem a little strange just now to think of persons having to be converted to faith in a possibility of salvation of the Negro, but there were among the colonists thousands who had never considered the Negro as belonging to the pale of Christianity. Negroes had been generally designated as infidels, but in the estimation of their self-styled superiors, they were not considered the most desirable of this class, supposedly arrayed against Christianity. There were a few Christians who did not look forward to the ultimate conversion of those infidels approaching the Caucasian type, but hardly any desired to make an effort in the direction of proselyting Negroes. When, however, that portion of this Latin element primarily interested in the exploitation of the Western Hemisphere failed to find the Indians the substantial labor supply necessary to their enterprises, and that the suggestion of men like Las Casas imported Negroes for this purpose, the missionaries came face to face with the question as to whether this new sort of heathen should receive the same consideration as that given the Indians. Because of the written law that a Christian could not be held a slave, the exploiting class opposed any such proselyting, for should the slaves be liberated upon being converted, their plans for development would fail for lack of labor supply, subject to their orders as bondmen. The sovereigns of Europe, once inclined to adopt a sort of humanitarian policy toward the Negroes, at first objected to their importation into the New World. And when under pressure of the interests of the various countries they yielded on this point, it was stipulated that such slaves should have first embraced Christianity. Later, when further concessions to the capitalists were necessary, it was provided in the early indoctrinated. Later, when further concessions to the capitalists were necessary, it was provided in the royal decrees of Spain and France that Africans enslaved in America should merely be indoctrinated in the principles of the Christian religion. These decrees, although having the force of law, soon fell into desuetude. There was not among these planters any sentiment in favor of such humanitarian treatment of the slaves. Unlike the missionaries, the planters were not interested in religion, and they felt that too much enlightenment of the slaves might inspire them with the hope of attaining the status of freemen. The laws, therefore, were nominally accepted as just the functionaries of the colonies, in reporting to their home countries on the state of the plantations, made it appear that they were generally complied with, as there was no such thing as an inspection of these commercial outposts. Moreover, no one in Europe could easily determine exactly what attitude these men had toward carrying out the will of the home countries with respect to the Christianization of the bondmen. From time to time, therefore, the humanitarian world heard few protests like that of Alfonso Sandoval in Cuba and the two Capuchin monks who were imprisoned in Havana because of their inveighing against the failure on the part of the planters to provide the religious instruction of the slaves. Being in the minority, these upright pioneers too often had their voices hushed in persecution. As it happened in the case of the two monks, it appears, however, that efforts in behalf of Negroes elsewhere were not in vain, for the Negroes in Latin America were not only proselyted, therefore, but were given recognition among the clergy. Such was the experience of Francisco Xavier de Luna Victoria, son of a freedman, a Panama charcoal burner, whose chief ambition was to educate this young man for the priesthood. He easily became a priest after having served acceptably in this capacity a number of years, was chosen Bishop of Panama in 1751 and administered his office 8 years. He was later called to take charge of the See of Trujillo, Peru. In what is now the United States, the Spanish and French missionaries had very little contact with the Negroes during the early period, as they were found in large numbers along the Atlantic coast only. In the West Indies, however, the Latin policy decidedly dominated during the early colonial period, and when the unwritten law that a Christian could not be held as slave was by special statutes and royal decrees annulled, the planters eventually yielded in their objection to the religious instruction of the slaves and generally complied with the orders of the home country to this effect. Maryland was the only Atlantic colony in which the Catholics had the opportunity to make an appeal to a large group of Negroes. After some opposition to the people of that colony, early met the test of preaching the gospel to all, regardless of color. The first priests and missionaries operating in Maryland regarded it their duty to enlighten the slaves. And as the instruction of the communicants of the church became more systematic to make their preparation adequate to the proper understanding of the church doctrine, some sort of instruction of the Negro attached to these establishments was provided in keeping with the sentiment expressed in the first ordinances of the Spanish and French sovereigns, and later in the Black Code governing the bondmen in the colonies controlled by the Latins. Although the attitude of the Catholic pioneers was not altogether encouraging, The movement for the evangelization of the Negroes, still less assistance came from the Protestants settling the English colonies. Few, if any, of the pioneers from Great Britain had the missionary spirit of some of the Latins. As the English were primarily interested in founding new homes in America, they thought of the Negroes as objects of Christian philanthropy, but rather as the English were primarily interested in founding new homes in America, they thought of the Negroes not as objects of Christian philanthropy, but rather as tools with which they might reach that end. It is not surprising, then, that the introduction of slavery as an economic factor in the development of the English colonies, little care was taken of their spiritual needs, and especially so that they were confronted with the unwritten law that a Christian could not be held as a slave. Owing to the more noble examples set by Latins, however, and the desirable results early obtained by their missionaries, the English planters permitted some sort of religious instruction of the bondmen, after providing by royal decrees and special statutes in the colonies that conversion to Christianity would not work manumission. Feeling, however, that the nearer the blacks were kept to the state of brutes, that the more useful they would be as laborers, the masters generally neglected them. The exceptions to this rule were the efforts of various clergymen in cooperation with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. This organization was established in London in 1901 to do missionary work among the heathen, especially the Indians and the Negroes. Its function was to prepare the objects of its philanthropy for a proper understanding of the church doctrine and the relation of man to God. This body operated through the branches of the established church, the ministrations of which were first limited to a few places in Virginia, New York, Maryland, and the cities of Boston and Philadelphia. From the very beginning, this society felt that the conversion of the Negroes was as important as that of bringing the whites or Indians into the church, and such distinguished churchmen as Bishop Loaf, Fleetwood, Williams, Sanderson, Butler, and Wilson persistently urged this duty upon their subordinates. In 1727, Bishop Gibson went out In 1727, Bishop Gibson sent out two forceful pastoral letters outlining this duty to the missionaries. Bishop Secker preached a soul-stirring sermon thereupon in 1741, and in 1784, Bishop Porteous published an extensive plan for the more effectual conversion of the slaves, contending that, despicable as they are in the eyes of man, they are nevertheless the creatures of God.